And welcome to this first parallel session at the third EU Cohesion Policy Conference. I can't tell you how pleased I am to have actual real people in the room. It's my fourth event since COVID, and actually having people around, it's such a joy. Another joy of COVID, and it is a slim silver lining, but it is nevertheless a silver lining, is the ability to have people not only in the room, but also virtually. And I've seen from the computer hiding in the corner that we do have people joining us virtually. So to those people, I say, welcome to the session. Thank you for joining us online and taking time out of your day. We should have had some housekeeping. There should have been 4 papers in this session, but unfortunately, Lisa McSorley, the final speaker, is unable to join us. We still have 3 papers, and it gives us time for a more active debate after each of those papers, and then potentially at the end. So the session is a policy that invests in all regions and cities, an instrument for economic growth and cohesion. And without any further ado, what I'm going to do is ask Ambre to come and speak. We will then have a video from our second speaker, and she will answer questions that are posed either to me in the room or on the chat from the virtual participants. And then we will, and she will answer those in writing. And then we will move to Vasilis, who's really live in front of us in the room for the final paper, and then we'll close up with a general discussion. So thank you for coming and joining us. And now I'd like to invite Ambre Mokor from the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies to take the floor. Thank you, Ambre.
Do I have to start? Let me check. Okay. Okay, yeah, great. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ambre Mokor. I'm French, but I work in Austria at the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies. And together with 2 of my colleagues, Roman Römisch and Stefan Jessel, we did a study back in 2020 on the impacts of EU cohesion policy on regional economic growth. So yet another study on this topic, but this time using structural equation modeling. It has to do with econometrics, and I will try not to be too technical, but still invite you to learn more about this technique. So a bit of background information on this study. So we did that 2 years ago, using 2008-2016 economic data and focusing on the 2007-2013 cohesion policy. But as you know, payments were made until 2016. And so we cover the entire EU 28 at that time at the NUTS 2 level of territorial disaggregation. So we have 276 regions in our sample. We did 3 papers. I'm going to present you the first one, but if you're interested, please do check out the other papers we wrote. One is on demand spillovers and the other one on reallocation of EU cohesion policy. These are all available on our institute's website. What was the aim of the study? The aim was to test a novel method, as I said, structural equation modeling. If you're not familiar with it, I'm just going to explain to you in a minute what it is about. And of course, we also wanted to contribute to the already rich literature on cohesion policy impacts while overcoming some of the shortcomings. So for instance, the fact that some explanatory variables, so factors of influence, are not directly observed, and we don't have a direct data set for this. We also have sometimes measurement errors, despite harmonization procedures, and of course, spatial spillovers, which are always, not always actually, but very often accounted for, but we wanted to investigate that further. And lastly, of course, we wanted to contribute or to inform the debate on cohesion policy, especially because at that time we were discussing the 2021-2027 MFF. What is the methodology of the study? We started with a literature review. to identify a preliminary list of explanatory variables. And then we did some very traditional linear regression analysis, which is actually equivalent to using a structural equation model with only a structural component. So a structural equation model has two components, a structural component, which depicts causal path relationships, and a measurement component, which is principally an exploratory factor analysis, which is our third step. So we did principal components analysis to see whether we could reduce the dimensionality of our analysis. And in the fourth step, we combined both of these components, so structural component, regression analysis, and measurement component, exploratory factor analysis, in a single SEM model. And then, of course, we estimated it using maximum likelihood, and we interpreted the results. Briefly on the data sources, basically we use common data in the EU, Eurostat, European Quality of Government Index, and our cohesion policy data comes from the Cohesion Data Platform. And we did two waves of data transformation. The first one is an arithmetical transformation. So basically to use mostly per capita variables, and also for our socioeconomic variables, country average, so country relative variables. This is very important because this is really much on purpose an approach that we took to investigate not only between country disparities, but within country disparities. So here we use ratios to the country averages. And then we did some basic statistical transformation, as you know, using the logarithm and also applying kind of a standardization like transformation. This facilitates convergence of the SEM model. Of course, it doesn't change the order of the values or the ranking of the variables, but it helps with the convergence of the model. Our explained variables is the average of the annual GDP per capita growth between 2008 and 2016. And we use different explanatory variables that prove to be relevant based on our preliminary linear regression analysis. So we have investment variables, of course, cohesion policy funding, cohesion fund, ERDF, ESF, but also other investment variables like research and development expenditure and gross fixed capital formation. And we use socioeconomic structure variables linked to education, economic structure, for instance, the weight of the primary sector in the regional economy, accessibility, urbanization, and so on. A few control variables, namely we test for the convergence effect. So we do include the level of GDP per capita in 2008 as a starting point, as well as institutional capacity, population size, and so on. And we also include a spillover variable, which in our case is the weighted average of the GDP in the neighboring regions. This is our SEM model looks like. So basically on the left-hand side, you can see the measurement component. We have two latent factors that were identified through this principal components analysis. So you can see them in the oval form. They're called latent because they're non-observed or non-measured, but they are depicted by observed indicators. So the first one, investment, is depicted by research and development, GFCF, but also cohesion fund, ERDF, ESF. And the second one, which we broadly called structure, is depicted by 7 socioeconomic variables. Those are, of course, observed. Lower education level in the population, higher education level in the population, primary sector, and so on for structure. And on the right-hand side, you can see the structural component. This is, of course, our main focus here. We want to explain GDP per capita growth through 2 main factors, investment and structure, as well as you can see on the very right of the graph, population, the neighboring GDP, quality of governance, initial level of GDP, and so on. So this looks like traditional regression. The only difference is that investment and structure are not directly observed. They are depicted by observed indicators that you can see on the very left. The one that he actually estimated is this one, the same one as you see before, but with error terms added to all of the observed indicators in our GDP per capita growth, as well as covariance links that you can see because we assume some correlations between those variables. So for instance, initial level of GDP with investment, because investment is mostly driven by cohesion policy, which is partly determined based on allocation eligibility rules by the initial level of development of the region. All of this, of course, we test to see whether these are actually correlated or not. And of course, we then estimate the coefficients and look for the statistical significance. So what are the results? First, on the measurement component of our SEM model, the first factor that we focused on, the one which is called investment, we see that R&D, and GFCF are negative indicators of this investment variable, and cohesion fund ERDF ENCF are positive indicators. So how do we interpret this investment latent and observed variable factor? We call it reliance or dependence of regions on cohesion policy funding as a compensation for having lower research and development expenditure and gross fixed capital formation. So basically, regions with a higher investment factor value will be those with lower research and development expenditure and lower GFCF, but higher cohesion policy funding allocation. And if you depict or if you map those estimated investment factor values on the map, you can see how it looks like. Nothing that will surprise you. You know, this is mostly how cohesion policy allocation looks like in Europe. But this time, remember that different indicators have fueled in this reliance on cohesion policy factor. Mostly, of course, an east-west divide to see in Europe, and mostly a country-level phenomenon. Same story for our second latent factor, which we call structure. So basically, the weight of the primary sector and the share of the population with the lower education are positive indicators of the structural latent variable. So basically, I mean a positive coefficient. And all of the other indicators, so knowledge-intensive services sector, higher education, higher accessibility, and so on, are all negative indicators. So how do we interpret it? This latent factor, this structural latent variable, has the laggardness of the regional socioeconomic structure, meaning that regions with the higher structure estimated value for this factor are those with a more farming-oriented economic structure, a less educated population, as opposed to regions with, of course, more knowledge-intensive sectors and higher accessibility, and so on. And if you depict the estimated values on the map, you can see this map. Here is not that much of a country phenomenon because we use country relative variables, of course, to investigate within country disparities, where you can clearly see, of course, how capital regions are singled out, basically those with the lowest structural laggardness. And you can also see some kind of a core periphery pattern between the center of Europe, so southern France, northern Italy, Germany, and regions at the EU external border, which are much darker colored, so there is a much more structural laggardness. And finally, what did I do? Yeah, exactly. The last step is, of course, the structural component. That was our main aim, to explain GDP per capita growth. We can see that the first factor, investment, which we interpreted as the reliance on cohesion policy fund, has a positive, statistically significant coefficient towards GDP growth, which is very good. So basically, the more cohesion policy funding you give, the more your region will grow, even though the more your region is dependent on those cohesion policy funding. And the second factor, laggardness of socioeconomic structure, has a negative contribution to GDP growth. We say that it's because of the difficulties that those regions with a lower capacity have in best exploiting cohesion policy funding. And all of the other variables, mostly constant variables that we used, have the expected sign, all good here. And we also show a convergence process because initial level of GDP is negatively associated with GDP growth. So the lower the starting point, the higher you will grow. So here we also see this catch-up process. In a nutshell, that's it. So combining principal component analysis and linear regression into a single structural equation model to explain GDP growth in EU regions. And what we said is that this model converges. So this is a very good outcome. And it produces results which are first statistically significant and two, in line with the literature and with our expectations. It also provides novel insight into the concept of structural laggardness and the importance of cohesion policy. What I mean by novel insight is the fact that we say that those are actually not directly observed, but we can still explain them through observed indicators, as I mentioned before. And we can also add error terms, and we can also add correlations between those variables. And a kind of a provocative statement when we say that it's somewhat inadequate allocation of cohesion policy funding. This is, of course, because of the approach we took, showing that on the one hand, cohesion policy funding allocation and reliance is mostly a country-level phenomenon. But if you want to highlight within country disparities, by looking at the socioeconomic structure of the regions, you can see wide disparities also within countries. Within countries, with a twofold, as we said, core periphery patterns at the EU level and within countries. I think that some colleagues or some other economics followed up with other structural equation models, so we would be very interested to know if anyone else has used this method. So far, we saw it mostly in psychology and a bit of transportation and trade, but not that much into regional economics. So I would very much look forward to knowing more about other attempts are using structural equation model. Thank you very much. Yeah.
So I think you have a handheld mic. So we have a handheld mic in the room. That sounded to me like a challenge to Louis Dijkstra, who I see in the room. So I'm going to start by saying, have you got your modeling wrong, and are you putting the money in the right place? Cruel and difficult, but perhaps you could make an immediate response.
So I really enjoyed the presentation, so thank you very much. I had some questions for you and also some comments to Sally's provocative question. The first question I had for you is, I noticed that in some cases you have the capital region as the most advanced economically, but the surrounding commuting zone or suburban region with a lot of people working in the capital as, say, the worst laggard in the country. So I was wondering if you took into account commuting effect. So that was my first question. My second point is, I was going to disagree with the core periphery element of the story. I mean, if you look at Europe, both EU-wide or country-wide, there are a lot of different effects that happen, and just the distance to the capital is not necessarily the most significant one. It could be the presence of a large city, it could be proximity to the rest of the single market, it could be a research university. So I don't actually think that within a country, core periphery is a good description of the pattern. So I'd like to ask you what other way you can interpret the within country variation. And then to answer Sally's question, I'm sure we're getting the allocations wrong. That's beyond any doubt. The allocations are the process of a complicated formula, hidden secret formula, negotiations with the member states, negotiations with the regions. But one of the things that I would highlight is the interconnectedness. And that's one of the things that we also emphasize with our regional economic model. Your investments aren't independent from the effects or what happens in other regions. So if you invest in one region, this may spur a trade with the neighboring regions or the neighboring country. And also within a country, you would expect quite a bit of spillover effect. So it's not because you put the money in a particular region that most of the benefits or all the benefits will only accrue to that region. So I think it really is trying to find where the money can make the biggest difference. We still believe that that is in the less developed regions, and our models tend to indicate that, but I'm sure we could do better, and I'm curious to hear what your reactions are to my first couple of questions. Thank you.
Okay, yes, thank you very much for these two questions. The first one on commuting, the answer is quite straightforward. We did not take that into account. However, it's probably maybe a bit indirectly accounted for in accessibility. So we use rail and road accessibility. So here there is some kind of a distance and time included in that indicator. And the second one on core periphery, yes, I would tend to agree. It's maybe a bit of an easy labeling that we used. Is more of not really core, but actually capital regions are very much outliers, and periphery in the sense that is pretty much everyone else within the country. And we also have this kind of core, this like blue banana kind of. For us, it's a bit different. It's not exactly the blue banana as we understand it, but still we can see regions really at the core of Europe around Switzerland in the broad sense that are also very much better placed than the ones that are much more at the periphery, and especially those at the external EU borders. So yes, we could define a bit more in detail what we call core periphery, but I would agree.
Blue bananas are not supposed to provoke me, but they do. Some people call them red bananas, but the banana in this question, the idea that there is this part of Europe that goes from London through the Benelux and Germany down to northern Italy, which is extremely developed, is a popular metaphor. And I've been trying to kill it for over a decade now, and clearly I failed to properly kill it. One of the things I would mention, a follow-up question and then a reflection. Accessibility is a tricky indicator, and by design, it delivers a core periphery effect, basically because we only look at a certain territory and we ignore the rest. So I'd be curious to see what kind of accessibility indicators you used. We've published some that are less prone to this automatic core periphery effect. And then in my latest desperate attempt to kill the banana, if you look at that area, if you look at Charleroi, if you look at northern France, if you look Champagne-Ardenne, there are plenty of poor, deindustrialized regions which happen to vote very heavily for anti-European parties. See presentation later today. So I don't think that area has any core characteristics that really define it as very successful. There are very unsuccessful regions in that area, and there's supremely successful regions. Think of Dublin, Helsinki, Stockholm, outside this so-called banana. So again, I think this is a metaphor that is quite old and produced sometimes automatically by the indicators you use. And so we should be quite careful, because otherwise we end up ignoring successful regions elsewhere. And you can describe Helsinki in many ways, but I wouldn't describe it as part of the core of Europe. And we ignore the difficulties many of these centrally located regions in the EU face. Thank you.
I don't know. I mean, I would definitely agree. I mean, we can also use another fruit if you want, and not a banana, because that is slightly different shape. In our case, it actually covers southern France, but definitely not Champagne, Ardennes, Picardy, and all of those regions which are definitely struggling. And I know what I'm talking about. And indeed, I mean, Dublin, Helsinki, and so on. But I mentioned also this core of Europe because also these best performing regions are mostly located to each other. In these next two regions, whereas of course Dublin is definitely a very, very dynamic regions, but doesn't have any neighbor in that sense. Helsinki as well to some extent, so it was easier to showcase on the map. But I would agree.
Colleagues, we probably have time for another question if somebody has a question or an observation that they would like to make. So.
I would like to ask you on your opinion. What is your opinion on so-called Lucas critique, which implies that policy conclusion implied by such models can be misleading? Thank you.
It's a very tricky one. I think, I mean, the main conclusion of our study is there are not very strict policy implications. It's really more about drawing attention to how you can interpret maps, as we said, depending on the indicators you use. And we really wanted to highlight the fact that actually the main factors for us that we use to explain GDP growth are non-observed. So I think this is, I don't think it's anything misleading here. It's more really drawing attention to the fact that potentially the most striking explanatory variables are not directly observed, and is mostly based on which indicators you use to explain them. I know it's not a very satisfying answer, but yes, I mean, our main conclusion is more about the methodology than actually the policy implications.
It's completely okay. So structural equation modeling is very challenging. it was very popular, but this popularity lost some steam after this paper. So it also somehow discourage many researchers maybe to take this modeling, because when it is criticized. So I wanted to ask some expert who what is the opinion on such.
Thank you. And one question here, and that will be the last question. Yes, you can.
Yeah, thank you. In defense of the academic inquiry versus the Lucas critique. So of course the Lucas critique is that the policy, that the elasticities, the coefficients that you estimate change if you change the policy. But I think we have one programming period, so there's no policy change within. And I think we're talking, even though we're saying like, redesigning, rethinking cohesion policy post 2017 and everything, we're still, sorry, 2027, I mean, the previous decade. We're still talking about a lot of policy continuity. So we're not in a kind of change of macroeconomic policy paradigm environment where, we used to do, I don't know, what was it before? Taylor rule, and now we're doing inflation targeting and whatever. So this is still a policy where you allocate, there's a bit of, as Louis said, there's a bit of politics probably involved in the allocations, but in general, this is an allocative / distributive policy. So as an academic, at least, I wouldn't worry too much about the Lucas critique applying in this case. I don't use structural cohesion modeling, but I found the presentation very interesting.
Good, thank you, Rod.
Thank you very much. Thanks for that great presentation. Please join me in saying thank you. Now, we're going to have a bit of a hybrid experiment now, because our next speaker is going to present online. We have a video from her because unfortunately she doesn't have access to a microphone where she is. I'm just going to ask our technician, can she hear us? She can hear us, so we can take questions in the room. Fantastic. So save your questions for the end. And now our lovely technician is going to play the video, and then we'll see how we go. And some questions may come through on the chat at the end. So Anna, so we now have Anna Patricia Fanjul Alamani from the University of Lyon in France. And she will be talking about analysing the ex post effects of community-led local development programmes. Anna, the video is yours.
Good morning, my name is Ana Patricia Fanjul, and I'm going to be presenting an analysis on the ex post effects of community-led local development programs. And the question we are going to be trying to answer throughout the analysis is this one. Do these programs, community-led local development programs, manage to reduce unemployment in Spain? And how do they do that? Do they do that in a way that is equitable or not? And we believe this question is of key importance. And for the latest wave of aid, to the best of our knowledge, there is no ex post analysis. So we really don't know how does this policy affect the Spanish municipalities. To answer this question, this is the index we're going to be following. We will briefly cover the literature on this matter, and then a brief background on this policy, the model, the econometric model we will be employing, and the results. So regarding the literature, there has been a lot of interest on entrepreneurial ecosystems, which is a way of studying entrepreneurship that goes beyond focusing solely on the entrepreneurs themselves. It is concerned with all the variety of factors and institutions that foster and contribute to this ecosystem. The main problem we face with this, however, is that most of them are tailored to very concrete urban settings. And so when trying to apply them to rural settings, such as the one where this policy is implemented, we find what Welter et al. Call a contextualized body of literature. Why? Because there have been many studies showing that entrepreneurs in rural areas face a number of hazards that are not encountered by their urban counterparts. For example, they face higher risk of the population, of poverty, narrower networks, higher unemployment, lower availability of services, including broadband access, which is key for many businesses, and also higher risk of social exclusion and inequality. This is why the framework we currently use about entrepreneurial ecosystems usually is not able to accommodate the specific characteristics of rural settings. Indeed, within these rural settings, the role of policymakers is much larger precisely to try to address these challenges. And so on the studies that have focused on the examination of these policies and of those coming from the common agricultural policies, the results have been very complex. We have found many direct and indirect effects across the literature, and most of them show positive effects of the policies, which is what we would find most intuitive, meaning that after you implement a policy, unemployment is reduced. And this can work through a variety of channels like income increases, increases in family job opportunities, telecommuting, spillover effects. But then there are also a wide number of studies that find a negative effect, meaning that after you implement this policy, unemployment increases. And this can also work through a variety of channels like increased productivity, which requires less labor, increase in market liberalization, the coupling of subsidy and production quotas, regional characteristics, and many others. And given the polarization of the literature, there are also a wide range of studies that find mixed effects. And this can be due to a variety of reasons, but among others, heterogeneity across sectors and across measures. This is why the literature always recommends to focus on a single measure to try to assess its impact and to try to provide an analysis that is very tailored to the specific context and at the lowest geographical level possible. And this is where we believe we can contribute. We seek to contribute to the development of the literature on rural entrepreneurial ecosystems by analyzing how does this bottom-up policy contribute to entrepreneurship in rural areas. And to do so in a way that is consistent with the recommendations from the literature, we have created a novel data set with information on over 12.6 million beneficiaries. There has been no prior analysis that covers the whole Spanish framework, nor one that does it at a municipal level. And this is why we are focusing on this matter. And we believe it can hold very valuable policy implications. So you will probably all be aware of the community-led local development program, but I just wanted to highlight this quote that signals its position as a key policy ingredient for other policies. This is a policy that has been very influential. In Spain, it was received by almost 33% of the municipalities from 2014 to 2020. And if you focus on the map on the right-hand side, you can see on green those municipalities that have received this policy. And if you focus on this second image, you can see that the municipalities that received aid roughly correspond with those that had lost the largest share of their population. And this is key for us because this program targets these municipalities and seeks to foster entrepreneurial activity in these areas. And if it had been distributed in a systematic way that does not align with its principles, then our whole analysis could be biased. But as we can see in the image, it closely resembles those areas that have lost the largest share of their population. Regarding the empirical approach, we have first created this novel data set with information on over 12 million beneficiary programs, which we have aggregated at a municipality level, which is allowed to level. And we cover with yearly data from 2 years before the policy was implemented, 2012 to 2020. We used as controls all the other common agricultural policy measures that were implemented in rural areas in this period. And then we have included a wide range of controls that we believe could bias the analysis as well, as you can see below. Regarding the econometric model, you will probably be familiar with the recent publications from Goodman-Bacon and many other authors showing that the difference in difference that we had been using up to now can render biased results if it is applied to multiple periods or to a setting with a strong covariance. And this is key in our framework because we have a very key covariate, which is belonging to a rural area, and we have multiple periods of aid ranging from 2014 to 2020. That's why we need to employ a novel estimator that has been recently developed by Callaway and Santana to perform our analysis. Regarding the impact of community-led local development on unemployment, you can see over here the results. What we have estimated is how does the municipalities that received this program compare to the municipalities that did not. This program is set to foster entrepreneurship in rural areas with this very innovative bottom-up approach. And what we seek to see is whether the municipalities that have received it really report lower levels of unemployment or not. And as you can see on the column on the right-hand side, which reports the aggregate effect of the policy, the municipalities that receive this aid indeed show a level of unemployment that is 0.53% lower than non-aided municipalities. And as you can see what you can see on the left-hand side are different aggregations of this measure. You can see the effect by calendar year, by group that was treated in each of those years, and also by the event study. And as you can see, the effect is highly significant and negative for all of them, excepting if you focus on the second row and on the last column, you can see that for the group treated in 2019, we have a slightly positive effect. And this could be due to a variety of causes, but what we believe is most plausible is that the policy has not had time yet to manifest the whole impact of the results for that group. And as you can see with the rest of the groups, the results were higher for those groups that were treated earlier on. You can probably see it better here. You can see the impact of the policy after it was implemented for the group that was treated in 2015, 2016, and so on. And you can see that for most of them, the effects seem to compile over time, which is a very nice result, except for the group of treated in 2019, which we have, as we have explained, it probably has to do with the time frame we're studying. If we were to repeat this study 5 years from now, for example, the results would probably be different. And here you can see the average treatment effect on the treated, both by group and by year. And you can see on the left-hand side, each of the groups that was treated, what has been the effect for them. And you can see that for all of them, as we were mentioning, except for the one in 2019, the effect was negative and significant. And on the right-hand side, you can see the same estimation by year. And you can see that the group that has had the highest impact is the one treated in 2016. And it seems that the groups that had been treated earlier on show larger effects, as you can see with the rest of the time periods. And regarding the impact upon inequality, we believe this is very important as well, because we find that the policy is effective for women, which are one of the most vulnerable groups within the ecosystem, but less impactful than for their male counterparts. The difference is very large. For women, unemployment is reduced by 0.2, and for males by 0.8. And this, as we will discuss, holds very valuable policy implications because this policy might inadvertently be widening inequality in rural areas. And this is something that has to be taken into account for the design of future waves of aid. So to conclude, we provide an analysis of this policy set to foster entrepreneurial ecosystems in rural areas. And we find that there is indeed a strong impact upon unemployment, reducing unemployment by 0.53% on the rural municipalities that receive this aid. And we also find that the policy is effective with the most vulnerable groups of the entrepreneurial ecosystem, like youth and women, but for women, it is less effective than for other groups. And this could have a possible impact upon rural inequality, which means that this should be taken into account and considered when trying to develop further programs. One of the reasons that could contribute to this is that many studies have shown that women are less prone to engage in entrepreneurial activities, which is a large part of what leader and community-led local development programs fund. And another possible explanation could have to do with the distribution of this aid. Perhaps more men than women have received this policy, but in either way, even though the concrete reason is beyond the scope of this paper, it is something that we find it's very important for policymakers to take into account when designing these policies. Further study will be needed to fully assess the effect of the program, but we hope to have contributed to the analysis of rural ecosystems. Thank you very much, and we are at your disposal for any questions you may have.
So Anna, thank you very much for what was a really clear video presentation. Colleagues, this is going to be a bit of a challenge for us because I think Anna has only the facility to type her responses. So if there are questions, they will come through on Zoom, I think, and I'm looking at our technician because you'll need to put them on the board so that we can see them. Can I, in the meantime, ask if anybody in the room has a comment or a question that they would like to pose while we see how this unfolds? Perhaps Vasilis and then our colleague here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Anna, for the video presentation. I hope you can hear me. So I have two questions. One is technical and the other one is more kind of framework question. So on the technical one, if I understood it correctly, in the event study part of it, you had an effect on unemployment kicking in already from T- to T-1. So is that an anticipation effect, or is it something that you would feel a bit worried about what the econometrics do? You know, is there something, a question about sort of the robustness of the results? And then the other comment/question is, if I understand correctly, the analysis at the level of municipalities or rural areas within rural municipalities, but then you're talking about rural ecosystems, and I wonder whether at least in the particular case of Spain, does it make sense? Isn't the municipal level too small a scale to talk about ecosystems? So don't rural ecosystems trespass cut across different administrative borders of municipalities? Thank you.
Okay. We'll just wait and see whether Anna is able to. I see no. Perhaps we have, while we wait to see whether Anna is able to give us a response to that, perhaps I can ask if there are any EU officials in the room that are connected with program. Perhaps would you like to make some comments?
Thank you. So colleagues, this is community-led local development. Until the previous programming period was only done in the Common Agriculture Policy remit. So we are not, for the moment, I can tell you that the 2014-2020, there were few attempts in few programs to set up this community-led local development under the cohesion policy funds, but they were very limited. It's not comparable at all. And there was one program in Sweden where they decided to merge all the sources, all the different shared managed funds in a community-led local development program, it had a lot of problems. So obviously for the next period, nobody's planning anything like that. But this is, I believe, the analysis on how the common agriculture policy, using the instrument of community-led local development, has impacted on very interesting results. What is the impact on unemployment levels among men and women? What is the level of addressing inequality and so on? So I don't feel very powerful to respect and to reflect on these things, but thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for those comments. In the hope that Anna, even if she's not able to respond to us, is still there. Is she typing? She can definitely, she could definitely hear us in the practice. Ah, okay. So can I then ask our colleague here, perhaps you could introduce yourself and then ask your question.
Yes, thank you, Anna, for your presentation. I'm Francesco from Politecnico di Milan. Actually, my question was exactly related to the anticipation effects. So the significant coefficient in the event study at years -1 and -2. So I think she already replied in the text. So
Okay.
I will not add other questions.
Okay, thank you for that. Any other comments on the presentation or questions directly to Anna? I mean, I think what we can see in community-led economic development is that these are really wicked problems. They're very difficult to solve at all levels, and no intervention is going to be absolutely perfect. I don't think we can optimize. Any other contributions that you would like to make? Because if not, I will thank Anna for the extreme lengths in which she has taken to be here and to present and to try and respond to the questions in the room. And I'll suggest that we move forward then to our final presentation by my colleague Vasilis Monasteriotis. So Vasilis's work is, I think, well known. You can come up. It's well known to all of us. Vasilis is one of the editors of the Regional Studies Association journal, Spatial Economic Analysis, and he works at the London School of Economics. Vas, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And thanks to everybody for coming. I'm sort of trying to use technology also in different ways, but after the challenging task that Anna had, I think I'm okay. So do I just click to go to my presentation? Okay, I need my glasses to see what I'm doing. Right, so let me bring the presentation up, okay. Right, so I'm Vasilis Monasteriotis, I'm based at LSE, at the European Institute of the London School of Economics, but also with a link to geography. So I'm sitting on both sides on regional policy, European policy, and the work I will present has been done with assistance by research officer for Richard Vanitopoulos, also at the LSE. And I'm looking at trying to understand growth. Yeah, not very original task, but as the terminology that we would use at the intensive and the extensive margin, and I will explain that. So let me get to it. So a bit of introductory things. I think when I was maybe 10, 15 years ago at the European Institute, and everybody was looking at kind of macro policies in the European Union, they would ask me, has cohesion policy delivered? Does it matter? I think now we have a body of literature across types of research, like qualitative research, let's say simple econometric analysis, more sophisticated counterfactual analysis, like in the previous paper, that do tell us that yes, policy interventions deliver. We have positive outcomes from the treatment from cohesion policy. And more recently, the questions, if you want, have moved on not only to this kind of yes/no evaluation. Does it work? Doesn't it work? But actually trying to understand the conditions under these things work. With Riccardo Crescesi and Ugo Fratesi, two colleagues, we try to coin this term, factors conditioning success and failure. And I think it shows that none of us is native English speaking, but Sally may suggest a better term for that. But anyway, we know context and structure matters, the type of treatment, but also targeting. In a paper in regional studies with Marco Di Cataldo, we try to show that actually investing in your weaknesses is more productive if you're a less developed region than investing in your strengths, in your perceived strengths, you know, kind of in the spirit of smart specialization, because you need to fix your problems first before you go. I think the question in the plenary, like if my sewage system is not working, am I really going to do a digital transformation? So in that sense, anyway, we know a lot about also about how local administrative capacities matter, absorptive capacity, quality of government, of course, and among other people, Andres has done a lot about the role of institutions in regional development. We know quite a healthy bit of things. I think where we're a bit lagging is trying to get a bit further than that and try to understand how things work. And I'm not only just the impact assessment, but also, you know, what works and how. So the drivers of growth, and drivers of growth, of course, is something that has been a term that has been used a lot from the 8th Cohesion Report. And also, I think in this conference, we'll hear more and more about it, but also the effectiveness of these drivers of growth. Okay, so this is, I think, my keyword, the effectiveness. I will be calling it productivity, but you can think effectiveness. And as I said, of course, we know things about the drivers of growth. We knew already in the academic literature, also in the policy literature, but definitely with the 8th Cohesion Report, we have a focus on drivers of growth. And I'm just copying a couple of pictures, basically from the report, a regression analysis by Anoni and co-authors in the report, which shows the different drivers of growth. And you can see the green colors are good, the red colors are bad. So secondary education is a bad negative contributor, quality of institutions is a positive contributor. And you can see that, you know, a bit of differences between north and, well, developed regions, let's say, and less developed regions in the south and the east. The conclusions come in the report, of course, that what are the drivers to growth is infrastructure, transport and IT infrastructure, the business environment, skills, entrepreneurship, innovation, so kind of the knowledge part of green and clean resources, which I think is a bit of kind of, you know, a sneaky way to put in the green transition in rather than any robust econometric evidence. Anyway, integration to global value chains. I think we have also papers in the conference talking about that, and a recent publication in the regional studies series by good colleague Riccardo Crescenzi, who has done a lot of work on global value chains, and of course, good governance, good institutions, quality of government, and so forth. So these are the things that I highlight, and I think what comes out even specifically in the reports is addressing the drivers of disparities. It is a transition which has to be fair, yeah, not only green, so equitable if you want, a focus on resilience, and we definitely learned that post-COVID or during COVID that we need a resilience and the ability to respond to asymmetric shocks. Shocks, you know, also remind us of the Eurozone and the financial crisis, but how regions can, you know, even a common external stimuli can be turned into an asymmetric shock because of different characteristics of the regions, and then you have to have the resilience and the ability to respond to that. And of course, the other challenge is the demographic, which belongs under this umbrella of megatrends, and the policy people here know that better than I do. And of course, the question of legitimacy, essentially, you know, left behind places, the rise of populism, the place of discontent, and all the other things. So of course, you know, in a way, I tell you, we need to think about the drivers of growth and their effectiveness, but of course, we know a lot about these things. And if I bring more copy-paste from the Cohesion Report, you can see that we know a lot. Like convergence has been achieved. We have been converging, or like the cohesion regions have been growing faster. So there is convergence, but you know, investing on your low-cost advantage may have its limits. Yeah, so that's what the Cohesion Report tells us. It tells us that innovation is the key determinant of long-term growth, but of course, the cohesion regions may be having weaknesses in the innovation ecosystem, which may be keeping them back. Now, this tells me is that it's a quantity effect. Yeah, so we need better, more innovation in the region. So I'm going to show you later that maybe that's not the policy conclusion. Of course, not only innovation, but also, I mean, innovation is also here, but of course, investment in infrastructure and governance. But recent research shows that the effectiveness of these investments depends on a number of kind of local contextual factors. So then this is about elasticity. It's about not how much you have of something, but what do you make out of that something. Yeah. So that's what the paper here is about. Favorable environment. We also heard by the commissioner talking about growth enablers, and so forth. Yeah, so that, we have an appreciation of all this. And then where we go with that is, I think, two policy recommendations that I want to challenge a bit. One is about sort of to avoid a development trap in the future. Less developed regions will need to boost education and training. So we're talking about quantity again, not about effectiveness of the quantity. And then, of course, the favorite word of any policymaker, reforms. Reform is the thing that saves you. If you don't know what to do, you have to do reforms, and then everybody's happy, other than the losers of reforms, of course. Yes, but anyway, yes, reforms, of course. So anyway, I hope I made the point that we know a lot, but I want to. I believe I can make after you leave this room, you will feel that I made a bit of more contribution to what we and you know. How? So basically, I'm borrowing from what is essentially a very extensive labor economics literature, where we try to use counterfactual distributions to explain differences between groups. So the typical example would be female wage penalties, male wage differentials. Why are they? Why do they exist? Do they exist because of discrimination, like for like, to identical people who only differ in the gender? The female gets a lower wage, yeah? So the elasticity effect, the productivity effect, or is it because those people are different? Females have less education, they are less motivated, or they invest in, or, find themselves in the wrong sectors, low-paid sectors, and so forth, yeah? Composition effects. So I'm taking this into the growth literature then, and in particular in relation to development. So I can tell you about the concept first before I tell you about the method, although I told you about the method. So of course we know, yeah, that to produce growth, you need two things. You need resources and you need to utilize the resources effectively, preferably, yes? So of course we can have growth deficits or development traps because we have under provision of growth drivers, under provision of resources of some sort. So for example, a region may have low levels of human capital, but of course also we can have traps and deficits underperformance because we have a suboptimal deployment of the given set of resources and an inability to create synergies. So one thing is that I have low education. The other thing is that I have low returns to education. So if I educate my people, they still don't produce, okay? So of course we understand this theoretically, if you want. And in the language of where I come from, the labor economics, we're talking about extensive margin, mobilization of resources versus intensive margin. And my daughter always tells me that I'm very complex when I present, so try to make it very, very simple. So a culinary example, if you're cooking, you can have a bad meal because you didn't have the right ingredients, so extensive margin, but also you can have a bad meal because the cook didn't know what they were doing with the ingredients that they had. Okay, so the intensive margin. Box ticked for my daughter. So let me move on to the methodology. Basically, the composition tries to take a differential and through regression analysis, produce 2 or 3 components that relate to this intensive and extensive margin. Yeah. So the green one, endowments, it is the part of the difference between in the growth of 2 groups of regions that is due to differences in inputs, that extensive margin, the ingredients in the meal that we're preparing. The second component that I call productivities is the differences in what these ingredients do, difference in the productivities of characteristics, the intensive margin. And then if you do the detailed decomposition, as they call it, you can get a fixed effect component, which is basically the unexplained component. It is the natural characteristic of, the essence of being the particular group, gives you something that the econometrician, let's say, cannot factor in. Okay, so the super residual. So this is the methodology. So I'm taking now to the data. I'm going to the data. So this is the growth rate. So 1.91 is 1.91 percentage points of growth, which is across the period between 2000 and 2020. So essentially 3 programming periods, give or take. The cohesion regions, or the regions that were either convergence regions or objective 1 regions or treated regions, grew by 1.22 percentage points faster than the rest of the regions in the European Union. And you can see that, so that's quite a big differential. And you can see that this is everywhere, before the crisis, in the middle programming period where it's mostly the crisis, and also in the recovery period. essentially pre-pandemic here, and we get the same result no matter how we define the treated regions, whether I say it is the regions that haven't been assigned to policy, so convergence regions, or if I say that I'll take the regions that received are in the top 25% of the distribution of who received how much money per capita. Still, the coefficients are in the same direction. Obviously, they're not the same, but there's a growth advantage, and that is why the cohesion report says we have convergence, and that's why today we're much happier about cohesion policy than we probably were 15 years ago, where the evidence was not so much in favor. Okay, so what drives this differential? Why do these regions grow? And this is my decomposition, doing just a production function. So I'm only having two factors, capital and labor, basically, to keep things simple. So what you can see, the highlighted table is essentially the table I showed you earlier, but I break it down into these different components, the ingredients of the soup, the skills of the cook, and then God at the end, the natural advantage, God said. So let's start with God. God says that cohesion regions should grow. Now, this sounds to the economists more like solo convergence, so beta convergence and classical convergence rather than God, but you can choose your religion if you want, except for the crisis. In the crisis, what was a natural advantage for cohesion regions became a natural disadvantage. Now, there is a national effect there, and it depends a lot whether you include Greece, you don't include Greece and Spain and stuff. So some of the natural disadvantage is not about the region, the essence of being you, but it's about, where God sent you, in which country they put you in. But what I want you to take from this is that actually there's a lot that is about, there's an inherent tendency of cohesion regions to grow, but also to be less resilient to crisis, to be the victims of bad news, if you want, irrespective of whether they have capital or labor or what they do with capital and labor, because that's in the other part of the table. So let's see, do they have a disadvantage? Do they have less capital? Do they have less employment growth? And what you can see is that basically, so the top line in this table is that the percentages, if you look, the contribution of the ingredients to the performance of regions is quite small. Minus 14% in the whole period, but if you look specifically periods, minus 6%, 2%, 0%. What we can see by zooming in is that where some action exists is in the employment effect. So basically, we have less employment created in these regions. Now, you can say this is awful, this is bad news, we don't create jobs, jobless growth and everything, but of course, the suspecting economist can also say that, well, that's typically capital depending, okay? When you grow, capital grows faster than labor because you catch up technologically with the rest of the, with the frontier. So it's not necessarily bad news, but it's bad news if you're looking for a job, of course, in these areas. Okay, that's it with the ingredients, but really, what we can see is that, again, the top line is that where a lot of the action happens is in the productivities. Labor is less productive. For every job we create in cohesion regions, we get less growth than in non-cohesion regions. But also, at least in the last period, capital is also less productive. Yeah. The results are very different in the crisis period because mainly of what happened in the non-cohesion regions and how capital investment became very unproductive there. But the main effect, if you want to take the whole period, is that employment growth drags us down, not in terms of quantity, but in terms of how much output growth it generates, but also capital growth is not doing great. Now, I can do this by adding more variables and do a more detailed decomposition of plugging in more factors, but then I have to ask Sally how much time I have. 3 or 4 minutes for this slide only. Okay. So very quickly, what you can see is, again, if I add many variables, many explanatory factors, I try to take the natural effect. Sorry? Yeah. So I try to take the natural effect away. The difference, I mean, the source of the differential remains. The abilities of the cook, the productivities effect explains a lot and actually drags us down. The endowment effect is very, very limited. The capital and labor effect is as in the previous table. I'm not going to tell you much about it. Let me highlight just a couple of things. EU funds matter. Of course, and we saw it also in the first paper by Amber. But what do we see? We see that in the ingredients component, yes, growth in cohesion regions is higher thanks to cohesion funds because they get more money, and that contributes to growth by, in my estimation, 12% of the differential is explained by that. But actually, EU funds are less productive in cohesion regions than in non-cohesion regions. And, you know, the policymaker wouldn't be hugely surprised to that, but it's good to put a number on that. And that is important because we need to put more money into the lagging behind regions, but also we have other policies that tell us we need to be more and more effective in how we use the money, especially because of overborrowing and the conditions about balanced budgets and so forth, you know. The story. Okay, let me then skip a few things and then just go to education, which is an R&D investment. So innovation, I showed you earlier, skills and innovation are important drivers of growth. Well, let's see. First of all, I don't find econometrically a big differential between cohesion and non-cohesion regions in how much of R&D they have or how much of education they have. Okay, I know there are differences, but on the average, and if you factor in other factors, then and you control for selection, for those that are familiar with the term, it doesn't come out. What comes out is a very negative contribution. So having lower human capital is more penalizing, like for like, is more penalizing in a cohesion region than in a non-cohesion region. Why? I don't know exactly why, but I know that then it means that the ability of these regions to convert high human capital into high output is compromised compared to the other regions. And the same for R&D investment. So we can say, okay, let's direct R&D in the less developed regions through smart specialization, through direct instruments that try to allocate R&D money into these regions, but it's less productive. And, you know, we always had this problem with cohesion policy. Is it allocative efficiency that we want, or is it a distribution that we want? Well, here we have a problem, Houston, so to speak. The main thing is that the natural advantage, the tendency of these regions to converge is very strong, but their essence, the productivity is dragging them down. So basically, is a kind of Robert Solow neoclassical convergence versus things that make you less effective, like quality of government or framework conditions, pretty much. So the entrepreneurial environment, and I have some names there. Okay, so I'm basically concluding now, just 2 minutes and I'm done. Of course, the cohesion report, and I put the cohesion report here, of course, to signify thinking in the policy community, understands these things and anticipates these things. But then the language that we use, I think it becomes a bit more detached. So, for example, a clear appreciation that's a quotation, creating new economics for less developed and peripheral regions, creating a new development paradigm. I mean, this is very powerful and very important. But then, of course, that can be lost in translation. What does that mean to create a new paradigm? How do you do it? So I think, well, one of the ways to do it is to make sure that the productivity of R&D and the productivity of education converges to the other regions. And we can talk about how you do it. Maybe we need more research, qualitative evidence, brainstorming, and so forth. But rather than a new paradigm on the generic, you know, we need to focus on the specific, I think. And the same would apply to everything else. I had a conversation with Luis in the RSA conference about the networking, the functional connections of places, and I think it was also in the comment that Luis made earlier about spillovers and so forth. You know, like places cannot become centers of excellence and this kind of smart places and fast-growing places if they're isolated. You know, in isolation to their environment, they need to belong to a system. Thing about the policy community, I can tell you about the academic community. You know, you can be a great academic, but if you're not in a great university, you're not a great academic. You need to be in that network or in the great conferences and so forth. Yeah. Likewise for places, I think. Okay, so I'm gonna cut it short and then just tell you that everything I told you applies on the average. But actually, there's big disparities within cohesion regions. Again, not a huge surprise. So the lowest of the low of the lowest, the lowest of the low, so the least growing cohesion, when we look at the part of the distribution that is low growth, the
low growth cohesion policy regions do very, very badly. Where the advantage is in the high growth cohesion regions. Okay, and you can see that the graph is plotted the wrong way around. I blame my research officer for that. What explains that? Is it the ingredients again, or is it the cook? Yeah, the productivities. And you can see it's all down to the characteristics. What does that say? It says that there's significant disparities in the endowments, in how much R&D the low growing cohesion regions have compared to the R&D that the high growing cohesion regions have. So yes, there is a point that you should focus on quantities, not only on endowments, not only on productivities, but it is in the spectrum of low, high growth within the group. The price effect doesn't matter, or the productivities effect. Okay, so I'm closing. There is a differential. We have success of the policy in that cohesion regions have grown faster, although much of that is because of God or neoclassical convergence. What we find is that, I think this is my main thing, no significant shortages, the extensive margin disadvantage, not shortages in capital, in R&D, in industrial structure, in education, even in agglomeration, things I didn't show you, other than in the very bottom of the distribution, the previous picture, okay? So it's not so much the quantity. What we need to make sure is that we make things more effective. And I wish I knew how exactly you do it, but that's what we need to do. Okay, the problem is with the productivities, especially on labor, education, and R&D, I think. Yeah. So what is the success of the non-cohesion regions? Why do they do well? Because they create faster job expansions in areas of higher labor productivity. So they actually do more and better jobs. Yeah. Because they can make for the whatever capital or the whatever R&D or the whatever public spending that they get, they can make more out of it. So there's something about in the environment, yeah, that does it. And of course, don't forget, it is also because they're more resilient. So when a crisis hits, they don't need to spend 5, 10, 15 years catching up from the negative shock. They're already there to continue growing. Okay, that was all. Thank you for your attention, and sorry for taking more time.
Wow. I look forward to the paper coming out in one of the regional studies journals. Can you please do bullet points for the policy implications? I think our colleagues in the managing authorities and our EU official colleagues will find that very useful. So colleagues, I am not going to try and summarize that. I will simply point out to you that an interesting conclusion is that cohesion-supported regions grow quickly but are more vulnerable to crisis. That's an interesting, and for me, a key takeaway. We've invoked the role of God, and I am not sure if that makes our colleagues in the room saints or apostles, or if the whole thing has got nothing to do with God, and we just need to work harder, think more deeply, read more research, fund more research. I'm not sure about that. I love the cooking metaphor, but what I put to you as a challenge is which regions are soufflés? So which are the regions in which we are putting a lot of investment and a lot of skill, but if you lift it out of the oven 2 seconds too quickly, the whole thing falls apart. And it does seem to me that relates back to this idea that some regions, although they grow more quickly, they're more likely to collapse. And I think that is a fundamental question for us. And I would love to hear comments in the room. And then finally, for the people that are really good at the quant behind all the science there, has Vasilis got the variables right? Let's give him some feedback. So I see that Lewis has commandeered the microphone without being invited. and I give the floor to you, Lewis, to respond.
Thank you, Sally. Thank you, Vasilis. Very interesting and provocative presentation. Wanted to pick up on a few things. I mean, if we look at what has determined growth over the past 2 decades, it is not that employment growth has been a massive driver of convergence. It is definitely a lot of that is happening in how we use that labor, in the productivity of that labor. But one of the things, you touched upon it a little bit looking at the industrial share, but if you look at, say, the poorest convergence regions, you'll find a lot of employment in agriculture. And a lot of that is not even necessarily for market production. It is for self-sufficiency reasons. The national accounts classifies that as being an agricultural worker, but the difference between being unemployed is not that big. So sometimes what we do is we try and take out some of that employment to really capture structural transformation. And I do think structural transformation can contribute massively to convergence, especially of these very poor regions, not necessarily all going into manufacturing, but also going into services and ideally higher value added activities. So my question to you is, I agree that it's a lot on the productivity end, how we use all those resources. But my question to you is, how does structural transformation play in this? And do you see that coming out of your analysis? Thank you.
So before I ask Vasilis to have a go at that, can I just say to our friends and colleagues on Zoom, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. We can see the chat in the room and I will read your questions out. So Vas, do you want to come back to the microphone to make your response? Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Luis. Yeah. So, no, I mean, the analysis in itself doesn't take into account structural transformation. So it's very, it's a year-on-year, it's a panel of data, basically. So there's no structural change per se. Of course, if you had gradual change that is factored in because there's regional, well, in some versions, regional fixed effects, there's country fixed effects and time effects and so forth. But that's an interesting question, I think, more broadly, that how structural transformation happens, but also how does it manifest itself in terms of differences in what I've been showing. We have to think a lot on the second question. How do you combine this methodology with some sort of kind of essentially a difference in difference logic, where you have something that there's a point of change and you compare the kind of the before after. I will have to think a lot, but there is some work that we're starting with Andres on the first part of the question, and it is relating mainly to the idea of the opposite, the counter. Yeah, exactly the opposite of the development traps in thinking about accelerations, actually. So, it's like Monday, Tuesday, you get cohesion policy, a bit underdeveloped, Wednesday, Thursday, and then on Friday, something happens. My references is to a song, Friday I'm in Love, and then suddenly you grow for the weekend, Monday, Tuesday, and whatever remain, again, quite blunt. And I think, of course, this is not necessarily structural transformation, but in a way it doesn't matter because as long as you grow, things are good. But also we know if we look at the national level, that's how structural transformation happens. What is the cause of the effect? Is growth causing transformation or transformation causing growth? In a way, if you can achieve it, in a way, it doesn't matter. But if you look at places like even Vietnam and, the examples that we have about where things change drastically, and we had some sort of exceptional growth rates for quite a long time, it was that, there was some element of structural transformation, but there was always also persistent high growth. And if we try to understand that in future research in the European subnational space, then I think I will be able to come in a future event and tell you more about that. Yeah.
Thank you very much. In fact, Sally referred also to the selection of your indicators and criteria. We can do this only if we assign you with the job, but it's your choice of your research. So we take it as a good starting point. But you mentioned at the beginning that, and I agree that first you have to invest in your weaknesses and then in your kind of comparative and competitive advantages. And how would you then assess that we have developed more than 10 years ago, the smart specialization strategies for each of the regions, and we're still keeping an eye on that, trying to put the investments together with the skills for the growth of regions. And we are facing the reality that there are regions which are in stagnation, there are lagging behind regions. So we have to do something more there. Obviously, we have to do more. And another thing is about, you say that the quality of investment, both hard investment and soft like education, research, and so on, is with a negative sign in lagging behind regions, so it doesn't bring the results expected. And you criticize that we are talking about the endowment, the initial investment in these regions. But I think that if we don't have the initial investment, we'll never be able to have a quality investment. Because if you don't have access to education or research and development investments and so on, there's no way that you get right away a quality of your education system or of your research results and so on. So I think it's not black and white. We cannot neglect the need for more investment, more ingredients, because they're not bringing right away the positive productivity. Thank you.
Okay, we should have a meeting and talk for hours about that, but the short version, shall I respond?
Yes,
Yeah, okay, so the short version of that. I mean, first of all, indicators, also not to be seen that I'm hiding from the difficult questions. I mean, also it is what Eurostat gives us. So the data is by far, not perfect. And you can see in all of the studies that we saw, including the cohesion report, people use the secondary education and not the tertiary, so the low end of the education, because if you put tertiary education doesn't work, if you put post-secondary education, so you're going for statistical significance and you use the, so there's problems with the data a lot, but then, more research, more funding for more research if you want. But anyway, okay, so I'll go to the, to the last question first, and then go to the smart specialization. So I didn't actually say that it's kind of the quality of investments. And if you want a problem with everything I present you, is I don't have a quality measure. So I just measure euros. Yeah. I do not measure even the sectoral allocation or the geographical distribution of the investments. Yes, yeah, but what I'm saying is that, it's not that somebody, both two regions got a computer and one got a, what's your preferred computer, Hewlett Packard, and the other one got an old IBM for the same money. It's not the quality in that sense, is the effectiveness of use. So it's the deployment, the productivity effect. And I think, I mean, I'm very sympathetic, like where I come from, if you want, intellectually, is yes, reallocation of resources to lagging behind regions. So very much the endowment effect. You have to put the investment and then worry about the effectiveness of investment. If we only worry about effectiveness, we have to accept there are inequalities. Yeah, and then you have to have fiscal redistribution at the other end, unemployment benefits, whatever. So I fully agree that we need to do the reallocation. I think even if we compromise, at least in the short, medium term, on growth. But I think the policy environment doesn't agree with me. And you cannot keep doing that. And even if policy somehow manages to accept that, then markets won't like it. And even if markets like it, then the people won't like it. And then we have the rise of populism and the revenge of places that don't matter and so forth. So I think we need, for the wrong reasons maybe, but we need to show effectiveness. And if it is that, then you cannot say, okay, I can be a bit wasteful because I have a good purpose in my policy. If the policy environment allows that, fine, but if it doesn't. Okay, on smart specialization, yeah, that issue is very important. Investing in, of course, in related comparative advantages, it makes sense intuitively. It has been shown in kind of more analytical research that it works, and all the work that has been done in the other side of the Atlantic by Ricardo Hausmann and so forth. It does, but of course it presupposes some sort of capacity that doesn't necessarily exist. And when when people do so the Harvard people are doing the growth diagnostics and they go to policy, they actually go, it's as pervasive, as intrusive as it was when the Troika institutions were coming to do the monitoring in Greece and in other places. Yeah, so they go to the desks of policymakers and they ask hard questions. So if you can do that with cohesion policy, fantastic smart specialization. But otherwise, you just tell somebody in a very remote area with very low capacities, we saw also in the presentation in the plenary, the argument of how many different instruments and policies the same managing authorities have to manage. And you tell them, okay, by the way, can you also develop the new comparative advantage that nobody, the markets couldn't think about, but you as a policymaker, you can develop. We're asking too much of them. So yes, do your sewage infrastructure first, become a place that is somehow more attractive, more, conducive to to people investing in the commons if you want, and then you can go to smart specialization. My take on this, but yeah.
Thank you. We have
Yeah.
a question, sir.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I'm Ruggero Cefalo, University of Vienna. Thanks a lot for your very interesting presentation. I think I come from social policy and welfare studies analysis. So of course, there are some differences in approach. The variables of outcomes that we look at are sometimes different and so on. But as a comment, some of your conclusions resonate with quite substantial literature and research, stating that in terms of, for example, education, it's not a lot the investment or the quantity of investment or the quantity of qualifications that we create that matters, but probably more the connection between the education and the labor market, or something more related, of course, as you said, to the quality of the investment. And this is connected to the question, even you partially answered actually. I wanted to ask you if you tried also the effect of other indicators on education with respect to primary, so upper secondary, tertiary, or employment by education, or even enrollments level. So if you try some other indicators in your
Yes, in part. I mean, I've only worked in this project only with Eurostat data, the database, the Cambridge Econometrics database, all this kind of European data, and they had that problem. So the priority here has been to go with coverage, so not to lose many regions because of missing data, and not to lose many years, because I want to have these 3 programming periods, and really, to put 270 regions over 20 years with not missing values is a bit of a task. There has been a bit of data interpolations as well that have gone behind that. But then you can go on the smaller scale, because actually I don't need thousands of observations for this analysis. So you can go to the smaller scale and say, do it for a year, and then do it separately for each year with different variables, perhaps to, do it for many years to make sure that the results don't change too drastically year after year, so you have some robustness, and then focus on the year where you have the bigger coverage in terms of variables, and try to understand, when I put secondary education, this happens. When I use secondary education enrollments, that other happens. Can I tease out some sort of mechanism or some sort of, a story, a narrative that goes behind the difference between the two otherwise similar coefficients? The same with industry share versus agricultural share. By the way, what comes out from the analysis that I didn't mention is that actually investing in industry, so increasing your industry specialization in the cohesion regions, works. When I do the regression for everybody without splitting, services is the strongest, but for the cohesion region, services is not the strongest. They're a bit behind in this kind of progression into the service economy, so to speak. Yeah. Yeah.
So, colleagues, I'd like you to join me in thanking Vasilis for a very good presentation. One of the things that I really like about Vasilis's presentations is they're full of metaphors and full of little stories. And the emphasis on education reminds me of a little story. When my son, who's now 30, was 9, he was playing Sim Zoo, and he had a problem, and he came down and he said to my husband, all my workers on my zoo keep going to the coffee areas and that they don't work. He said, and I said, well, what are you going to do, Oscar? He said, I'm going to remove all the staff coffee areas. So he deleted them all. And then 2 days later, and he said, my zoo's not going very well, Mum. And I said, well, they've all gone on strike because there's no coffee areas. So I said, well, that is an unfortunate thing, and I hope that the animals aren't suffering. What is your plan? He said, I don't know. But he came back about 3 days later and he said, I've sorted out my zoo. The answer was to invest in education, and the higher the qualification of the workers, the less likely they are to spend time in the coffee areas, and the more likely they are to spend time looking after and enhancing the animals. He might not have said it quite like that, but I promise you that is what he said. So hurrah for education. Can I also say hurrah for all of you? The joy of this event is that we bring people from the managing authorities, people from the EU institutions and researchers together. Can I encourage you to sit in mixed groups over lunch? Find somebody you don't know, learn something about them. So thank you. And in closing, please can I thank our technician, without whom I would have been completely struggling, and who enabled Anna to give her presentation under very difficult circumstances. So Anna, if you're still with us, hurrah to you, and thank you very much. Lunch is now being served. Thank you.